Tao and the Cosmic Principle. Chapter 1. Consciousness and Science. Ancient Wisdom and the Quantum Hypothesis. The Arrogance of Intellectuals. The Rise of the Materialists. What is consciousness? What is our consciousness? The I is consciousness itself, but no one yet knows where it comes from. Brain physiologists claim that it is nothing more than a creation of the networks in the brain, but is that really true? It may be a one-sided truth, but anyone would question the ambiguity of an answer, whose subjectivity depends on the brain possessing a persuasive power that exists as an object. If broken down, all beings can be reduced to atoms. Furthermore, the concept of elementary particles that constitute atoms, nucleons, protons and neutrons, and electrons, and also the quarks that make up nucleons, is understood through quantum theory, leading to the denial of existence. More detail on this will be provided from Chapter 4 onward. In conclusion, since the quantum, which is repeatedly generated and annihilated, i.e., its fixed existence is denied, forms the I, the fixed existence of that I is also denied. This leaves room for renewed debate about the significance of the I of consciousness. In other words, the question arises as to whether to deny this consciousness as non-existent, or affirm it as unique. Philosophy has been debating this question without pause for the past 2,500 years. Consequently, we must consider whether consciousness is universal. According to stubbornly inflexible rational reductionism, everything simply came to be by chance with the Big Bang, and it has no meaning. Is that really true? Are this universe, Earth, nature, our societies, intelligence, the arts, wisdom, loves, sorrows, and history, all merely a contingent existence without value, merely a product of the vagaries of the Big Bang? I have thought about myself ever since I was a young child. I have been plagued by the mysteries of existence. Is the existence of you and I without meaning, as some biologists and physicists would say? Is the consciousness and thought, that originate within us, merely an illusion? What is the true nature of that illusion? Many scholars simply conclude that its existence is genetically meaningless, mere coincidence, without explanation. Philosopher David Chalmers posits consciousness as one of the basic components of nature, in the same way as space, time, and mass are basic constituent elements of physics. This idea has existed since the time of the ancient Greeks, and indeed, it was rather commonplace. However, with the advent of the dualism of the mathematician and philosopher René Descartes, most scholars, swept up by the materialism accompanying the development of the sciences, came to consider consciousness as a mere collection of atoms, and ceased attempts to discuss the depths of consciousness. Forsaking philosophy, they came to consider consciousness to be nothing more than a product of happenstance. Consequently, all the values that humanity had built up until then were rejected, lost to nihilism. Even in Western philosophy, typified by Greek philosophy, philosophy began with the understanding of God. Ancient Greek intellectuals came up with theories not considered by the common people, and argued over the existence of God, and the best among them became students of natural philosophy. These great philosophers, embodied by Pythagoras, paved the way for mathematics, geometry, which most people today do not understand, while analyzing nature and human consciousness as God's creation. Many Western intellectuals still pay tribute to these ancient philosophers, including Plato. I cannot help but feel that the fact that many Japanese people have lost the sensibilities of these Westerners is a dark cloud hanging over Japan's future. In Judaism too, there is a respect for a 5,000-year history, and the great men of faith that appear within it. The same is true in India, which also has a great history of philosophy. The Chinese sages still reign as pillars of our psyche. Nevertheless, it seems that materialist philosophy has enjoyed an overwhelming surge in recent years. With Japan's defeat in the Pacific War, World War II, the conventional family collapsed, and nuclear families became pervasive. Moreover, compulsory education on the denial of ethnicity followed, while materialism was further amplified by socialist teachers. The result is that Japan, in which it used to be safe to leave doors unlocked at night, has become a society in which those doors are broken even when locked, and people are assaulted on the street. Nonetheless, Japan surprisingly remains the safest of the developed countries, including Western countries. Even now, however, ordinary people have lost their spirits, and have come to forget prayer at Shinto shrines and Buddhist altars. It is easy to conceive that society will continue to become more acrimonious, if the expansion of materialism continues. Moreover, we have become prejudiced against religious beliefs, unthinkingly reaching the quick conclusion that there is no God, fool. It is fine to conclude that there is no God, having thought the matter through, but to cry fool without thinking even once is lacking in intelligence. It is no different from the ignorance of people who say, I believe in God, without ever thinking about it, or fools who rush to belief in money and power. We must think thoroughly about why God does not exist. We are required to also consider why we feel God does exist. Who is God in the first place? It is necessary to think this through fully and properly. The concept of God differs considerably depending on race, nation, region, and religion. Indeed, all of them may be a sham. I feel that in the early 21st century, humanity will have to reconstruct God anew. Since the time when humanity began to form groups, fear has driven people to dread and anticipate the mysterious power of God. This began with the appearance of a single spiritually attuned person, and the will of this powerful charmer brought people together, gave them courage, and brought peace to the group. Sometimes, the people of the first civilizations even engaged in the horrific practice of human sacrifice, using sacrifice to demonstrate the purity of their actions, and gain the forgiveness of an angry God. Such a God was a fearful thing. The strong spirit of the charmer further captured the hearts of people, urging that they live a righteous life, and preaching that punishment would be meted out to those who did not. This is where the difference in the intellectual abilities of the charmer will create a large gap in the civilized evolution of the group. Where a good charmer emerged, the previously wrathful God came to be spoken of as a God of compassion. This finally developed to the point where it took the form of a religion. Doctrine then took on a more philosophical aspect, and following competition with other religions, the groups that won out, and their teachings, have continued to the present day. These are represented today by Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Shintoism, etc. What they have in common is that they speak of universal good and evil, and claim that there is an absolute being that governs them. Strictly speaking, only Buddhism is different, but popular Buddhism falls into this category. In other words, it contains a divine concept of a relatively absolute being. The denial of faith and the error of funbetsu, vikalpa. This view of God lost its reality, as a result of the development of physics, and natural scientists, physiologists, and biologists, mainly those who recognize themselves as intellectuals, sought to escape from a view of God that they considered a dependency, abandoning their belief in God, and turning to a belief in material things. In Buddhism, this kind of thinking to judge with attachment to things, is termed funbetsu, vikalpa, and is considered to be the greatest of the worldly desires. This is classified as a folly of the ordinary people, but those who advocated intellect had no way of knowing such things, moved to this new materialistic faith, and abandoned their faith in God. As a result, the morals and ethics previously upheld by religion collapsed, and a society began to form, in which domination, power, and money prevailed, in which its losers were seen as inferior. Foremost examples of this phenomenon would be history's despots, Hitler, social Darwinism, and modern American civilization, to which can now be added Chinese civilization, that surpasses the former. Today's Japan is similar, in its folly. However, physics has presented a new position, compelling a revision of the concept of God that humanity had previously believed in. Particular to Christianity, the conceptualization of the human Jesus as God has led to a distortion of the absoluteness in relation to other religions. Western scientists have also taken a particularly anti-Christian position in this regard. Philosophers such as Nietzsche, Heidegger, Sartre, Wittgenstein, and others advocated for freedom from this powerful spell, and it is this freedom from religion that became an affirmation of human existence, and a self-identity for physicists. Quantum mechanics, which emerged as a definitive new field of physics, demonstrated denial of existence, leading some physicists to the erroneous values of meaninglessness, and thus led to the spread of atheism, mainly in the developed countries. Simultaneously, the stupidity of actions typified by religious terrorism, and the existence of outright superstitions, has led some scientists to dislike, and to reject religion. This was a trend true of intellectuals in general. The problem here, however, was that they had merely changed the object of their faith from the metaphysical to the physical. Although all they had to do was discard all faith, they instead shifted to a new God, that of belief in scientific principles. That is, nothing substantively changed. They had merely turned from one folly to another, from their old funbetsu to new ones. In order to rightly cast aside that foolish belief, we must begin with doubt about the absoluteness of our very existence. Do you really exist? What does existence mean? Are you and others different beings, or just a single entity? We must discard the ideas that we have thus far taken for granted, and humbly consider the oneness of ourselves and others. We must realize that the fact that everything is governed by cosmic constants, and has only quantum existence since the Big Bang, leads to a conclusion that is the exact opposite of the materialistic reductionist worldview. That is to say, it connotes the existence of an ineffable will that is beyond the human intellect, and even beyond God. This is also the thesis presented by a physical principle, whereby elementary particles respond to human will. Scientists' arrogance. To me, the ideal image of a human being is a peasant farmer of yore. The peasant farmer watches the calendar, consults the weather, wakes up with the sunrise, grows crops as though they were his own children, overcomes harsh environments by himself, and goes about his life with little complaint. Such farmers do not exist today. You may say, but I believe they do. I still yearn for such a life, but before I knew it, I grew accustomed to city life, and grew physically and mentally useless. Perhaps, most people find themselves studying to cram for university entrance exams, and then, they go to the city to be pushed to work. This is probably the case with the majority of Japanese city dwellers. Those who live spiritually rich lives in the countryside, and those who achieve their desires are blessed. Many people wake up to sports nowadays, which is a splendid thing. Lately, I've been bothered by the arrogance, though it may be too strong a word, of scientists, and how it is expressed through condescension to the general public. I think their knowledge is great. To an ignorant person like myself, intellect is something to aspire to. Mathematicians' formulas seem to be colored with beauty, but, unfortunately, we common people lack the knowledge to understand them. By no means is there a lack of sensitivity. It is simply a lack of knowledge. However, I understand what they are trying to say. I do not find these mathematicians particularly disagreeable, but recently, I have become somewhat fed up with the scathing words of some biologists, physicists, and brain physiologists in terms of their influence. A prime example of this is the biologist Richard Dawkins, who will be mentioned later. He seems to have a strong resentment toward religious fundamentalists, which is understandable. He advocates the idea of the worship of gaps, and argues that religions seek out ignorance that science has not come to understand, and claim God to be there. This is the case of the United Kingdom and the US. It does not apply to Japan at all. He also criticizes disreputable mystics. I agree on that point. It is disgusting. However, I cannot accept the term mystic as the concept that Dawkins and his ilk criticize. This is because Laozi's ideology, which is placed at the pinnacle of Eastern philosophy, truly suit the name mysticism. As East Asians, we cannot overlook an expression that seems to insult this supreme wisdom, that stands alongside that of the Buddha. This is also because the mystery, that transcends human knowledge, appears clearly in our sensibilities. Those who are not sensitive to spiritual things and are thought dominant, cannot feel this mystique. However, many people, especially artists, are attracted to, and can see a glimpse of such mystique from the depth of their soul. The mystics they criticize are, in a word, nothing more than authoritarians peddling the mysteries of a dubious lie, and obvious frauds. However, Even those of pure spirit possessing intelligence, who are nothing of the sort, have been the target of criticism along the same lines. In other words, their issue is that they have fallen into the denial of all religion with this kind of childish religion. In the words of physicists, such as Albert Einstein and Max Planck, who stand in direct contradiction to them, it is irrefutable that it is beautiful to have a world of faith that heals the spirit. If we reread the works of Dawkins and others, what they talk about is a criticism of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism today, and perhaps Buddhism is not included in that criticism. In that case, I would no longer have reason to criticize them, but unfortunately, that does not seem to be the case. They are genuine mechanistic materialists. Above all, with their strong sense of presence, my concern is for the characteristics of Japanese people, who put blind faith in the opinions of authority figures, without analyzing them. Going forward, I am extremely concerned that Japanese people will become increasingly materialistic, and lose sight of their spiritual sides, and will fall into a value system, in which greed is the only pillar of life. It is unfortunate that Japanese physicists, who stand in the same position as Einstein and others, do not condemn this tendency publicly, for fear of being criticized by some of the hardline materialists. It seems to me that only brilliant people studying quantum theory are confronted with this God problem, and other physicists do not have such a high level of awareness, and so tend to fall into materialism. Moreover, unlike Western researchers, Japanese researchers, who were brought up after World War II, and lacked the spiritual foundations like Christianity, have been unable to acquire knowledge of the advanced concept of, to borrow a phrase from Einstein, cosmic religion. However, only select quantum theory researchers can be compelled to admit that there is some form of will in this universe. Biologists with good intuition also tend to sense the existence of other forces, through the intricacies of the mechanisms of nature and brains. Dawkins, on the other hand, argues for atheism through the mechanical nature of genes, but in his case, he was an atheist before beginning biological research, and did not arrive at atheism as a result of his research. That is a definitive point of difference from Einstein et al. Einstein and others originally believed in Judaism and Christianity, but came to completely reject them through their studies of physics. Furthermore, although not a believer in a theist God, they came to infer some kind of cosmic consciousness. This differs from the emotional atheism of Dawkins and others, in that it was the product of research and discourse. Thought-dominant tendencies and mistakes. The view of religion I advocate is that taught by the Buddha, Kugen, thought of emptiness, as taught by the restorer of Buddhism, Nagarjuna, which is simultaneously a logic of mercy. This is a philosophy, doctrine, shared with physics, which is completely different from the religious views known to the world. My interest in the universe led me to admire a physicist's career, merely out of a desire to learn about the structure of the universe. That is not to say that I see in physicists the human charm of peasant farmers. However, the inquisitive attitude of physicists is nothing short of amazing. It is a beautiful thing to see someone exploring something in any field, not just physics. That is not to say, however, that the arrogance and severe condescension toward the common people typified by some scientists is to be admired. It is enough to make one worry for the future of our children. This is because the attitude of faith in science is substantively the same as the fanaticism and blind faith of those who have fallen into and been subjugated by religious fundamentalism. In that sense, a false scientist is the same as a false believer. That trend can be said to be strongest in Japan. For some time now, there has been an unwritten rule in Japan that intellectual equals atheist, which is not permitted to violate. Jumping to such a conclusion is clearly foolish. It depends upon the childish mental shortcut, according to which, unless we can see something with our eyes, or hear it with our ears, it does not exist. It is also credulously said that those who believe in God are weak-minded, and that forms the basis for their faith, but this thinking is excessively short-sighted. Weak-mindedness is not termed faith in religious philosophy in the first place. Faith is a spirit that cannot be possessed without a strong mind. These thought-dominant materialists cannot possess the courage of the Christians eaten alive by lions in the Colosseum, under the brutal Roman Empire. In my eyes, because they have no linguistic experience of life and death equals clear conscious thought, they, at times, appear to fall into an intellectual trap to escape from the fear that lack of experience brings, taking a shortcut into this narrow-minded value system. This is exactly the fool that Heidegger named Das Man, the people. The aggression of thought dominance. There is another important perspective. One thing these thought-dominant people have in common is an inability to understand the minds of others. Therefore, they think they can understand others by converting their words, actions, and emotions simply into individual symbols and quantifying them. But we cannot deny that this clearly creates a gulf between this understanding and reality. They tend to have a significantly inferior ability to directly perceive and understand others. Unfortunately, they are not aware of their tendency. To cover for this, they try to verbalize and quantify. As a result, however, their verbalization and quantification are acclaimed as research outcome, and ultimately, this is established as an academic discipline. How ironic, then, that they are able to acquire authority in this way, but this, by no means, signifies that the original paucity of their perception has improved, nor do numbers alone guarantee a superior perception. A lack of cooperation with others is another characteristic of such thought-dominant people. They also possess an inherent, stubborn, and unconscious refusal to transfer information to others, regarding it as their own. This is used as a means of reinforcing their self-identity, for the sake of self-preservation. However, that is not to say they are always aware that they are engaged in such behavior as described above. Only by doing so can they preserve their identities. As a result, they become overly self-confident, with successful types demonstrating even greater arrogance, relying simply on knowledge for all their values, and judging everything completely based on their knowledge, clinging to their own views, and denouncing those who disagree. Nor do they ever argue calmly, instead becoming intensely emotional, opposing for the sake of opposition. This is, in part, to hide that their intuitive understanding is poor. That said, there is a counterargument that intuition cannot be trusted in the first place, and that is correct. As with the hypotheses of physicists, most intuitions are false. However, everyone should recognize that this intuition leads to the final, correct solution. In scenes of death such as battlefields, commanders with good intuitions, and the ability to make decisions daily, have produced better results than commanders, who think only in terms of logic, that is, one hears more stories of them, rescuing subordinates. The heroes of history have certainly possessed this strength of intuition. It is necessary to consider this fact, recognizing the weakness of thought-dominant human beings. Darwin's intuition and Kelvin's formula. Let me introduce an anecdote that addresses whether intuition or scientific calculation is correct. It was on the question of the Earth's age that Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was at odds with the understanding of physicist William Thomson, 1st Baron Kelvin. 15 years older than Kelvin, Darwin traveled the world aboard the Beagle, noting that the Galapagos finches and elephant tortoises had different appearances on each of the Galapagos Islands, proposing the theory of evolution based on his findings. We know that even today, biology is studied based on this fundamental concept. At the time, he had studied as many fossils, flora, and fauna as he could find, and as a result, came to be convinced of one thing, that the forms of the roughly 1 million species of organisms must have been simpler in prehistoric times, and that it took a process of hundreds of millions of years for them to evolve from these simple forms to the complex animals of today. It would take at least several thousand generations for any change in the morphology of a species to become apparent. Calculating the lifespan of an animal as, say, 10 years, would result in a figure of 5,000 years for 1,000 generations, assuming that offspring were born midway, 5 years, through an animal's life cycle. A few thousand generations would require about 30,000 years. In that case, 10 million years would pass in a flash. This assumed a category within the same species, and could not be compared to the evolutionary phase transition from amoebas. Thus, Darwin intuitively believed that, if evolution required hundreds of millions of years, the Earth would be even older than that, and he presented his intuitive view to conferences. Kelvin argued vehemently against this view, from a geophysical standpoint. On the basis of the minute amount of heat radiated from the center of the Earth, he asserted that the Earth had gradually cooled from the lava state, at the time of its birth to the present day, and that, from the time required for this cooling, the Earth was less than 40 million years old. Of Darwin's unscientific attitude, he is recorded as saying in 1873, "We find at every turn something to show the utter futility of Darwin's philosophy." Later, he declared that the Earth was even younger, 24 million years old. Darwin boiled with anger at his attitude, and he referred to Kelvin, in a letter to his friend Alfred Wallace, as the odious spectre. Then in 1904, 22 years after Darwin's death, Darwin's intuition would triumph with the arrival of the young Ernest Rutherford. He discovered that radioactive substances, such as radium, were present in the Earth's interior, determined that these released heat, and stated at a conference that Kelvin was attending, that the Earth could be as old as Darwin had claimed. As this example shows, there is such a thing as good intuition. We must not forget that almost all of the great discoveries of physics are due to this intuition. What is more, scientists must learn the error of grounding their work absolutely in a developing scientific theory, such as Kelvin's. Nor should we forget that it was science that corrected the theories of the authorities. In this sense, science is great. However, scientists should not fall into Kelvin's rut. As an aside, on the basis of Marie and Pierre Curie's discovery that uranium naturally decayed into lead, Rutherford was able to determine the age of rocks by examining the quantity of lead they contained. According to their calculations, it would take 4.6 billion years for 50% of the uranium in rocks to become lead. This is called the half-life of uranium. During the same period, a meteoroid was examined using B.B. Boltwood's calculations, obtaining a figure of 4.6 billion years, which is now the accepted answer to the age of the Earth. The abnormality of Japan's intellectuals. Science is essential, and will determine the future of humanity. However, science is not absolute, as Kelvin's example clearly illustrates. It is ultimately nothing more than an opinion of the time. That assessment, too, may be mistaken, and even if it is correct, that is all there is to it. Anything more than that is the ignorance of knowing nothing. Scientists must remember humility. We should be humble, and remember that we do not even know 1%, 0.1%, or 0.000% of omniscience. If we are not open-minded, we might overlook hundreds of years of correct discoveries, much like in the Middle Ages. Despite this, it is frightening to see how, much like the religious oppression of the Middle Ages, the authority of today's scholars dominates the world, denouncing those who oppose their standards of value. This is, of course, true of only some people. I do not mean to say that all scholars are this way. However, the statements of that group are given authority, and that is a rather dangerous idea. What is frightening in Japan is that it has reached the level of the citizenry. Despite scientists' claims to rejoice in revealing that, of which we were previously ignorant, their unilateral condemnation of thousands of years of religious history is filled with contradictions. It is unfortunate that they have devolved into engaging in very personal criticism, when all that is required is, for them, to present their point of view, as a matter of logic. Their authoritative, anti-religious statements have taken on the form of condoning discriminatory behavior against others. This is because it has also led to a denial of morality and reason. This has become a particularly grave social evil that now runs rampant. This type of psychological structure can also be considered a factor in the extraordinary smears and bullying in Japanese schools and online. It is becoming increasingly difficult for the elderly and vulnerable to live in Japanese society. This is a contemporary trend in Japan that would have been inconceivable when I was young. It is an objective fact that morality has declined significantly on a town-by-town basis. This sin is heavy. Well, the concept of sin does not exist for materialists. The way in which Japanese intellectuals are represented by those in the mass media is abnormal and nothing but thoughtless. It is an odd way to put it, but in Japan, this is a violation of freedom of belief, under Article 20 of the Japanese Constitution. Nonetheless, it is ridiculous that those who self-identify as intellectuals reject religious ideas without being aware that they are violating the Constitution. What is interesting is that they loudly proclaim the second and third paragraphs, but ignore the first. The reason why the first paragraph refers to the denial of specified groups privileged by the state is because this article, originally, referred to the rejection of Shintoism as the state religion of Japan by the U.S. military, GHQ. This is a clear stipulation that Japan will not become a major military power again through state Shintoism. As a result, individuals' right to freedom of religion was given comparatively few words. Nonetheless, it is necessary that people be reminded that the guarantee of this right is by no means of little significance, but rather is enshrined in the Constitution as a major right. Such prejudicial statements should have been a taboo in the mass media from the outset, but they are not. The mass media is also passionate about selectively picking words, but ignoring the Constitution with no hesitation is a problem. The funny thing is that those who advocate protecting the Constitution have fallen into the contradiction of stating the exact opposite, and the mass media lacks the rationality to notice this. The prodigious writer, Mishima Yukio, once cited authoritarian scholars and critics as those he disliked the most, and he was entirely right. As you might expect, this statement corroborates the claim that he was a man who truly established his own self. Together with Mushiano Koji Saneyatsu, who wrote Bakaichi, for me, he stands out among other writers for his magnetism. Lao-tzu's paradox. We must realize that both physics and religion are ultimately ignorant. I do not know anything save what I know. The things I do not know engulf the things I do. The supreme Eastern philosopher, Lao-tzu, states the following. The masses are laughing happily, eating a great feast, and enjoying life on the springtime plateau. But I alone am quiet, as a newborn, neither moving nor smiling. I float lightly with nowhere to go. The multitude all have enough, and more to spare, but I alone have nothing, as if I lost all. I have the mind of a fool. I am precisely that dull fool. Everyone is cheerful, but I alone am downcast. They seem full of life and brilliance, while I alone am filled with gloom. They all have their merits, but I alone am as a stubborn and useless creature. Not a single merit have I. But I alone am different from others. For it is that I value, and am nourished by, the Great Mother, that is Tao, who is little thought of by all others. Lao-tzu speaks sarcastically to the seemingly wise intellectuals, and the masses. He says a foolish person, who knows the existence of Tao, the graciousness of nature, and is engulfed by it is the more fortunate, rather than a layperson swayed by such pretentious wisdom, desires, and knowledge. That such a person, a scholar, has become so arrogant as to fit humanity within a single value system is, as Lao-tzu says, something we must recognize as truly ridiculous. Physicists must realize that, no matter their intellects, they are nothing more than kindergarten children, compared to the intellects of the distant future. What we must pursue is not Aristotle, regarded as the father of all sciences, who presented only a superficial analysis of phenomena, but instead the meaning of the Platonic existence, which considers the essence of phenomena to be most important. It is not just the laws of physics. It is the meaning behind them that is at issue. The fact that some of today's physicists, biologists, etc., have lost all understanding of this, is deeply concerning. At the very least, it is a relief that the anthropic principle, the theory of human will, has appeared in cosmology, and receives strong support from many scholars. I hope that those good scholars will maintain an eye for the natural philosophy, handed down since the times of ancient Greece. The world of natural science. Doubts over common sense. The wonders of electromagnetism. Ask the question, "Why are you able to stand on the floor?" how should the reader respond? The reply would likely spring forth, "I am certain I can stand on it, because my legs and feet are strong." But there is a surprising fact here. Modern man knows that all matter consists of atoms. Everything, visible and invisible, even you and I, is made up of atoms. In other words, it was atoms that ate tempura at lunch, not you. Consistent with that account, then, it is atoms standing on that floor. Yes, it is only you, an accumulation of atoms, that is standing there. That you can stand there, is an action of those atoms. Would you believe me if I were to tell you, that if a certain property of the atoms was to stop working, you would pass through that ground or floor? I am not speaking of the occult. The answer is simple if you know physics, but if you do not, then you will not understand at all. So, first, let me explain atomic structure for those readers who are disinclined to physics. The size of the typical atom, diameter, is about a 100 millionth of a centimeter. With the exception of the hydrogen atom, which is the combination of a proton and an electron, all other atoms have a nucleus, also called a nucleon, consisting of protons and neutrons at their center, about which revolve electrons, as small as 1/2000th of a nucleon. This is easy to understand, if you imagine the structure of the solar system. The existence of atoms is now common knowledge, but at the beginning of the 20th century, most scientists considered atoms to be a concept of convenience for expressing formulae for chemical reactions, and did not believe in their existence. Scientific progress has advanced unimaginably in the past century. The existence of the atom was proven by Albert Einstein, when he was 26 years old. When he found that the movement of fine pollen on the surface of water had a peculiar Brownian motion, he realized this motion was caused by gas or liquid molecules striking the fine pollen particles, and as a result of his mathematical analysis, he calculated the size of the molecules through the occurrence of momentary fluctuations. Finally, he determined the size of atoms, and revealed that they do in fact exist. Protons in atoms have a positive charge, plus, while electrons carry a negative charge, minus, and, plus, and, minus, attract one another, and do not separate. I will not go into detail, as this will be explained in Chapter 4, but a force called electromagnetic force acts on both of them. Since all matter consists of atoms, all matter is subject to this electromagnetic force. Incidentally, there is an interaction between nucleons called strong force, which acts to bind them together. Then, here is the answer to the question. In atoms, positive, plus, protons, and negative, minus, electrons attract one another, but with your feet on the ground, the negatively charged electrons of the atoms in your feet, and the negatively charged electrons of the atoms in the floor, repel each other, making your feet float in the air. We all played with magnets as children, so you should understand. A linear motor car is constructed, using a magnet that floats in the air, and this operates on the same principle. In fact, you are also floating in the air, above the ground. From the time you were born, you had the ability to float in the air. Everybody is taken aback when they first learn of this principle of physics. I imagine that readers, who did not previously know this, are open-mouthed. But this is a truth of this world. What can be further understood from this is that electromagnetic force is stronger than gravitational force. You can see that what you think is common sense, is truly nothing, compared to this fact. For that reason, you and I can both stand on the floor, and sit in chairs, because of the repulsive force of electrons. Whether a bed is too hard or too soft, is simply because of a difference in this repulsive force. The sensation of a handshake is actually an illusion. Everything is just the repulsive action of electromagnetic force. So, what do you suppose would happen, if this electromagnetic force was not present? We would go through the floor. The question is, can you reconstitute your body on the other side of the floor? Without electromagnetic force, atoms would not form in the first place, which means that this world, and, of course, humanity, would not exist. Even with the humanity's background, I can understand that in the far future, a time will come when it is possible to reconstitute atoms, once they have been broken apart. This is not because I have been watching Star Trek. Rather, we can imagine it to be possible, by understanding the basic concepts of physics. Most people think that physics is difficult to understand, but that is an issue with the way teachers teach the subject, and if you understand the essentials before starting with the equations, the basic concepts are surprisingly interesting, and easy to understand. From physical principles, life and death are equivalent, in terms of the principle of energy conversion, but a person who has not considered the matter, might be stunned to learn, that physicists are troubled that death somehow occurs. Life also consists of atoms, which are made up of protons, neutrons, and electrons, but even these are known not to exist discretely. That is to say, they are particles, waves, and magnetic fields. Particles do not exist as individuals. This is the quantum world. A quantum understanding of physics would mean that neither humans, nor the world, both consisting of atoms, actually exist. And, yet, here you are. It is an unmistakable fact. Not to mention that when we reach the question of will, the issue becomes much more complicated. The world is not as simple as materialists believe it to be.